The dig of this story this afternoon, the blast, the explosion at the Givaudan food coloring plant, and many people who live in that neighborhood are saying, how could this happen again? Let's bring in WDRB.com reporter and investigator Marcus Green. Now, Marcus, in April of 2003, it was a case of deja vu. 21 years ago, there was another blast at this same plant.
That's right. Many people, and I think a lot of us, when we first began to hear of this action today, thought this is reminiscent of 2003, and that's when an explosion, as you mentioned, Gil, at the same site killed one worker, injured others, and led to a shelter-in-place in the area. Now, that blast in 2003 ultimately was determined by investigators to have occurred in a vessel called a feed tank. Of course, this is used in manufacturing caramel coloring for food. That's what this plant does. And further, federal investigators found that that company at the time, Williamson, did not have basic standards in place to determine if the equipment was sound, and they were faulted for failing to properly train workers about the risks of using that equipment.
So what came out of that was a series of recommendations, basically fixes, and that's common when you see these catastrophic failures at major manufacturing facilities.
Correct. What came out of this was recommendations and improvements. One of the ones that occurred was the state labor cabinet, which is essentially which oversees the federal workplace safety regimen. They were told to make sure that this company understands what it has to do, how it needs to be safe. And what we've seen since then, as far as we can look back, there haven't been any major incidents, investigations, or even complaints at the then Williamson, now Givaudan factory in recent years. Now, there was, in 2023, 2 instances of fines by the local air pollution control district for what I would consider to be administrative failures, not notifying local city regulators when there were emissions problems, or even filing basic documents. But in terms of workplace safety issues, none that we can find in recent years that at least comes close to any kind of concern like the one we've seen today or back in 2003.
And so let's walk through those APCD, air pollution control emissions. I know we both are familiar with APCD. Right. Let's make it so the folks at home can understand what's going on here. Louisville's threshold for air quality is tighter than federal regulations.
It is. Louisville has a very strict program in place to ensure that federal standards are not compromised, and so it's not unique to see companies from all stripes be cited and fined. And in this case of Givaudan, they had been faced with allegations. They decided to settle those without admitting fault. So these were claims.
Common. We should say that is common.
In other words, they got out ahead and said, we're going to go ahead and pay a fine. We're not admitting to these. These are allegations. But it at least shed some light on how this plant has been operated, that there were instances that got into the crosshairs of city regulators in recent years.
Okay, so typically the city's going to come with a pretty complete report, right? And so these emissions or excess emissions, there's a threshold of what you can release. And so if they have been as the city alleges, in violations of the excess emissions, the company's going to come back and, settle this under what's called an agreed order. Basically a contract that says, we're not admitting guilt, but we're going to pay for it now.
Correct. And these were agreed orders, as you mentioned, but it is important to note that one of the things that the city found was that they weren't submitting basic compliance reports. So these are fundamental documents that are supposed to show how a company is operating, and that's one of the areas that Givaudan did not comply with in the most recent agreed order from 2023.
Okay, can you walk us through, and I'm sorry, are you going to talk about the name change?
So I have a question. Before we move on to your question, Gil, going back to the explosion of 2003, there were issues at the plant that caused this explosion. So how long would safety and compliance checks be going on at that facility, and would there be more because of what happened there?
I mean, typically it depends on the industry. It depends on what kind of workplace safety protocols are in place. I know with a lot of industries, you will get routine inspections, routine compliance, walkthroughs and things of that nature. So I know that the 2003 explosion and that 2003 catastrophic incident did trigger a whole host of recommendations, but in the years from there until the present day, it's really hard, at least as we found in just the last couple of hours, to really paint a very thorough picture of what kind of safety regimen was in place at this plant.
And especially because you were talking about the name change.
Sure. Kind of walk us through that, because we heard some interviews from neighbors earlier today with our live reporters who called it D.D. Williamson. That was what it was known as until 2023, correct?
Until 2021. So D.D. Williamson operated at that site for a long time, and in 2021, a Swiss-based conglomerate called Givaudan, which makes fragrances and food colorings, really the business that D.D. Williamson was in, the food coloring business here in Louisville. Givaudan purchased the Louisville assets and moved its coloring operations essentially to Louisville. And so the work that's been going on in Clifton at the former D.D. Williamson plant is basically what was being done in prior years. It just was being done under a new owner and a new entity that was operating it. So, Givaudan, a very multinational company, expanded its reach and took on this Louisville property, but from what I can tell was pretty much doing the same thing it had always been doing there, which was primarily making food colorings.
So if there was a name change and say the same reason for the explosion that caused the 2003 explosion is the same that caused today's explosion, would there be stiffer penalties even though it is under a name change, or how would that work?
I think it's just too early to know, because really what's going to come down to this investigation is determining what were the factors that contributed. If they were similar to what had happened in the past, and there were things that are found in this current investigation that may be in the same ballpark as what happened in 2003, I can envision a scenario in which inspectors and investigators would be at least more mindful of what kinds of fines or citations are going to come out of this. But I just think at this current moment, we're only a couple of hours after this explosion, after this incident, it's really too early to tell. But I would imagine investigators are going to be looking at whether or not the mistakes of the past and the faults of the past were repeated today.
Yeah, we've all been up here doing this in this city for a very long time. What does history tell us about what comes next?
What's going to come next is a very long investigative process. In the case of the 2003 explosion, it was well into 2004 when the Federal Regulatory Board began to issue final reports, hold neighborhood meetings. So as rough and uncomfortable and sad and horrific a day it's been for the neighborhood, we have a lot more weeks and months ahead where there will be investigations and investigators on site. We're really in the very beginning stages of trying to understand what happened and what the impacts are.
All right, thank you, Marcus Green. We have been